Um, glad you're all here. This is my first meeting that I'm doing from Columbus. I got back a little over a week ago. Okay, Dave, why don't you give me the courtesy pitch?
Yeah, I'll just, as usual, please keep your microphones muted if you're not going to be asking a question at that particular moment, especially if you're going to be washing or breaking dishes or moving furniture or setting off explosives or any of the other things people somehow find necessary to do during Zoom meetings. And that's about it from me.
Okay. All right. Okay. The big news at the museum, of course, is the convention that's coming up in a few days. We're frantically working to get ready. Been quite a project clearing out the warehouse because it's been 2 years of accumulating stuff. And we're getting there, so I think we'll be ready. If you're planning on attending, please register. It's really important because we have to, as a week from, well, actually this coming Monday, I have to give the caterer numbers for lunch and dinner. And if I give them too low a number, some people are going to go hungry, and that's not going to be good. If I give them too high a number, then we're going to be paying for meals that we don't need, which cost the museum money. So please, please register if you plan on attending. Also, still selling tickets for the TRK 120 auction. I don't know if we're going to make it to the $10,000 this year. For some reason, this isn't as popular an item as the CT 100 was. We're at a little over 5,000 now, but generally a lot of them come in at the in the last week. So we may still make it. If we don't, what happens is that whatever money has been collected in ticket sales is split 50-50 between the museum and the drawing winner. So get your tickets. If you haven't, buy some more if you have. We've had a couple of interesting donations recently. The most exciting one is that John Folsom decided to give us his Silvertone pre-war. It's the Silvertone version of the TRK 112, which is made in 1939, as most of you know. This set is just in gorgeous shape, and it works. It was just delivered yesterday, and I'm going to be showing it in a minute. But this is among the rarest sets out there. I think the numbers I have show that about 60 sets were made. Now, RCA made them for Westinghouse and for Sears Silvertone, and they made about 60 of all their 4 different models for Silvertone. So I can't imagine there were more than 30 of these things made, and this is the only surviving example. It's basically a TRK-12, just in a different cabinet. And just today, we had a TRK-5 donated to us in California. It's complete, but it's got some water damage on the bottom of it. And we'll be getting it back to Columbus and then most likely sell it because we have a nice model on display, which of course will raise some money for the museum. We're up to 165 members, which is, I think we were at 140 last year before the convention. And at the convention, we always pick up 10 or so, maybe 20 memberships. So we're doing really well with that, doing really well with cash donations. So unless there are any questions about that, I'll move on back and see if I can successfully show you that Silvertone. Okay, that's it. By comparison, this is the TRK-12. Very similar. In fact, the front of it is identical. The radio is, I guess there are a few differences, but it's essentially the same on the inside and the top. And I'll show you got the back off because I say it just got here. And I don't know how well this is going to show up, but this thing is a monster. This is the television power supply, and it has a 6,000 volt supply and a regular B plus and a huge filament transformer. You can see the CRT. There's the neck of it. The thing is a mile long. This is the TV chassis. This is the radio power supply, and over here is the radio. And it has a interlock. I don't know if you can see it here, but they've got these interlock switches. So when you take the back off, it shuts down. The reason for that is with the brute force high voltage, you can kill yourself. I've got that bypassed, obviously, now. Now I turn this thing on. Let's see if it cooperates. Oh, the plug came out. Hold on just a second. My camera work isn't quite as good as Larry's. Well, looks like we've lost our RF feed. I don't know what's going on. This afternoon, it had a picture on it. So I won't waste any more time waiting for it. All right. Okay, that's all I've got. Let's, I think let's turn this over to Alex Magoun. I haven't seen Alex forever. I'm so glad to see he's making a presentation. It's always enjoyable to listen to him. And I think everybody is going to enjoy this. So let's go to Alex.
Thanks, Steve. I'm happy to be back virtually. I'd also be happy if somebody else wanted to do their little presentation before mine. But be that as it may, I've got a little bit of old and a little bit of new here. So this is a very rough draft and incomplete as usual, but Dave Sika assured me that that was okay. And I hope I've got enough for you guys to start brainstorming and reacting appropriately. I wanted to bring up this notion of television restoration, excavation, preservation as a form of electronic archaeology. And this is something I've been observing as a historian at the IEEE History Center. I end up having my hands in an awful lot of pots beyond television and RCA. Most recently, we had an IEEE Life Fellow in the Caribbean who sent us an extended, I don't know what I call it. It's going to be a booklet of some sort in which he recreates the transmission and reception of Trinidad and Curacau's wireless telegraph station from about 110 years ago. And this was just sort of the latest example I've seen. Now going back, if I go back to the David Sarnoff Library and the Early Television Foundation, of a whole bunch of really interesting, smart people exploring different ways to recover the electronic world that isn't in text. It's prehistoric or not necessarily ahistoric, because there is documentation. But as you guys know, and I've been following bits and pieces of the 15GP22 and the CRT restoration efforts, how much nonverbal knowledge there is in making your televisions work, and what went into transmitting long wave, radio telegraphy 120 years ago. So that's what I just want to poke around a little with that tonight. And if it gets you guys thinking, great. And if it doesn't, you can move on to something else. So here's, I wanted to sort of get into, if we're going to talk about something, we should try to get a definition of terms. So what is electronic archaeology? And we'll use as an adjective the use of electricity as a means of controlling the flow of information or flow of electrons to communicate a signal. And then archaeology, with or without the second A, is the noun of the study of the human past, often before there were texts, through the material remnants of that past. So if you guys are dealing with, chassis and picture tubes and so forth, it's like, how do we bring them back to life or make them work the way they did before, or even understand the fabrication process? All of those are forms of this field I will call electronic archaeology. And, you could also call it paleoelectronics if you like, because there are still people, struggling to restore old cell phones and early microprocessors. There's a determined group here in New Jersey at the Sarnoff Collection, now at the College of New Jersey, who've been going through, one of the RCA engineers, Joe Weisbecker, was very early pioneer in microprocessing computer, basically home computers in the early 1970s. And they've been going back and trying to recreate his video games and programs and work them through. So what's, not necessarily too surprising, or it shouldn't be surprising to me because I'm supposed to know about this stuff, but it turns out there are any number of other people who are looking at a bigger picture of electronic archaeology and making it part of the broader field of all sorts of media, not just electronic media, but typewriters, as you can see in UC Perica's What is Media Archaeology? And then his other, collection of people. All these are historians, they're communication studies people, media studies people. Some of them are more practical than others, but they've generally, they've got some interesting things to say about how do we respect the past, understand the past on its own terms, and then bring that, up to the future to sort of answer that so what question. Why are we so obsessed with how things worked in the past? How does that help us or make a difference today? And that's always a worthy question, to be ready to answer if you deal with a reporter or a writer or somebody covering your project. And this is actually arguably a subset of a much older field that goes back 60, 70 years at least, of industrial archaeology, which is, a lot of Americans, Europeans, some Asians trying to understand basically the rise of industrial, the industrial world. How did these factories work? How did this water wheel system work? You could even, and you can take that back, further to what you might call, your original archaeology of how did Stonehenge work. But in this case, you're beginning to get a mixture of not just the artifacts, but some of the documentation, whether it's the repair manuals, whether it's the factory specifications, whether it's contemporary articles in books and publications that explain how these technologies we don't use anymore, and are, conceivably the people that were responsible for them are gone. I mean, archaeology is often associated with prehistoric sites. But this is an archaeologist, industrial archaeologist, cited in Bart Lee of the California Historical Radio Society, which has a wonderful website. They've been opening up an awful lot of, posting an awful lot of their publications, which are well worth exploring. And it turns out Bart, who's an excellent historian, and I think he's also in his real life a lawyer, which may help explain that. But he has a lengthy article, which is available online in the AWA review from 2015 about radio archaeology and the Mount Tam wireless station on, outside of San Francisco. And it's a lengthy, thorough, thoughtful article posing this issue of, trying to understand these high-powered radio telegraph stations that the Marconi company, the German companies, a whole variety of wireless companies were developing to send these electromagnetic waves around the world. And I would guess my first experience with this electronic archaeology was when I got into the David Sarnoff Library, and Scott Marshall, pictured here, I've forgotten how he introduced himself to me, or I introduced myself to him, or we met, whether it was a New Jersey Antique Radio Club meeting, or possibly an open house that I held at the library. But he's a very skilled electrical engineer with a deep interest and respect for past technologies. And he volunteered to restore the 630 TS that had been donated to the library. And he got it working. He went through, analyzing the circuits. You can see some of the recaps in the chassis there. He's got, some documentation, but as he explained to me, and I am not an electrical engineer, there are intuitive, nonverbal ways of understanding circuitry that defy writing and defy those of us who are not trained in electronics. So he did this, and either he or Dave Sika introduced me to the opening show of the first meeting. Well, it was going to be the only meeting of the Early Television Foundation. So we all got in, I believe, Dave's car and did the road trip out to Hilliard, Ohio. And here's Jeff Bourne introducing, the find of the meeting, in my opinion, one of the few 1939 RCA cameras from the World's Fair that, through a curious set of circumstances, ended up in West Virginia, which was really impressive. And I distinctly remember the conversation at the meeting about restoring it and making the point, as archaeologists would, not that I was thinking of archaeology at the time, but if you're going to restore something, it's very important to document what you changed, what you took out, what you put in, rationalize your explanation so that somebody else could, take that apart and redo it, and make sure you're sort of following the original, and if you're not following the original, explain what caps you put in and that sort of thing. But that's sort of this example of preservation and trying to understand the workings of a 1939 iconoscope electronic TV camera at the very beginning of that electronic video age we're still in. And then I remember being really taken with this wonderful array of CRTs. I went back, I remember I came back for the 2004 meeting, Steve, but I'm afraid I don't think I've been back to Hilliard since then, and I somehow feel rather confident you have a much more professional setup at this point. But this was a really astonishing, display going back to that Dumont in the rear. And this whole issue of, how do you rebuild these if you have a 1939 TRK-12 or a 1954 CT-100? The picture tube is almost the most unique aspect of these pioneering televisions. And like I said, I've been following little bits and pieces of the efforts to work in, I believe, in France, and here in, I think, Hawkeye in Iowa before they closed up. This is on Steve's website. That's where this comes from. I make sure I credit where credit is due. But you have all these fascinating issues of how did, the workers in Indianapolis, manufacture these, or the workers in Lancaster or, Harrison, New Jersey, make these picture tubes, deposit the phosphors, coat the cathodes, all the rest of these sort of internal interactions that make each of these, an electronic system for which the documentation is erratic, I would pose to say the least, especially if you're trying to make these work and get new parts or new materials for them. And then, so you've got a couple nice pages on this whole issue of CRT rebuilding. And again, the creativity and dedication of the collectors and people working on these are truly remarkable for somebody like me who really doesn't do much hands-on activities. But it's I just want to shout out and just again encourage anytime you do this, and I would say the ETF website does a nice job of, again, going through step by step, what did you do? It's like entering it in a laboratory notebook, because you are essentially an electronic archaeological laboratory in trying to recreate what they did in the past. And I would say this is arguably, considerably harder than, rebuilding, say, an Edison tinfoil cylinder. So here's one of those, 1939 CRTs, and I read, you sort of closed the book on this, and I hope that's not entirely the case. But again, it's really to be applauded, and I, hope everyone is sharing what they've learned from this process of figuring out how did those engineers, technicians, factory workers do this, 80 years ago. And then there are a number of other efforts. I'm blanking on this. I had remembered hearing something about replacing picture tubes on Philco Predictas, and you can see this is a 36-minute video on this process. And then I want to tie this a little bit to the larger, this larger issue of electronic archaeology, which involves scholars, some of whom started as electronics or electrical engineers. The second writer here, Chun-Pang Yang, is a professor at the University of Toronto, but he started his career as an electrical engineer before going to MIT for a PhD in science and technology studies. Jed Buchwald, the first writer here, got his undergraduate degree in physics and became a historian of physics and science, who is still at Caltech, and a wonderful writer. If you Google Jed Buchwald, you wouldn't be disappointed. He's a very fine writer and a very thoughtful scholar. And this was this sort of effort about how do Heinrich Hertz know what he was looking at or looking for when he's trying to figure out if James Clerk Maxwell, very complicated articles and books on electromagnetism is as a version of light. It runs along a spectrum. Whether this was a legitimate claim or not, it's not as if Maxwell worked this out and everybody agreed. there was a lot of uncertainty for most of the 19th century and into the 20th as to what exactly is going on with, they don't know about electrons. They still believe in an ether. And, we still are not really sure how the heck these signals get from one place to another. But at the University of Toronto, in the Science and Technology Studies Department, Yang and some of his graduate students got together and built some of this equipment. They obtained a space that's sort of similar to the space that Hertz worked in Germany, and did some modeling. It's like you can see, this is a rather lengthy article. It's from pages 125 to 171. It's available online. It's what's called open access, so it's free to download, or it's not free to download, but it's free to read online. And you can skim through this, but this was published relatively recently, and it's a very thoughtful, careful exploration of what on earth did Heinrich Hertz learn and confirm about Maxwell's theories, which some people would say they are at least as important as Einstein, including Einstein. So there was a fair amount of digital analysis in this article. These are the waveforms of the spark gap reception. And, they've got a couple more pictures showing they did this over the space of 2 to 3 years. And this is, again, moving on here, fairly close to where I live in New Jersey, is the site of AT&T's so-called pole farm in Lawrenceville, New Jersey. This was their radio telephone transmitting site. They had a reception site in northern New Jersey, I think it was Pohatcong. But they used a couple of giant antennas. One you can see there taken in an aerial shot. And then they began to establish a whole series of what are called rhombic antennas. They have a nice concrete exhibit, you might say, in the lower left there, showing the rhombic. They're basically directional antennas pointing towards the Caribbean, to Bermuda, Willemstad, Paramaribo, and then just dozens of more of these rhombic antennas. They're set up on 4 posts, and then the wires are strung at the top of the posts, and basically they're directional antennas to send these radio telephone messages for those who could afford these between the 1920s and the 1970s. And then AT&T, like RCA in Long Island, and other companies, once you had satellites and the beginning of fiber optic communications, these stations were no longer important or valuable or worth maintaining. And they tore down virtually all of the towers. There's one remaining at Lawrenceville. You can still find the concrete stanchions here. You can find them in Tuckerton, New Jersey, for another transoceanic site. And the only sort of existing radio station is the one in it's in Sweden. It's got an Alexanderson alternator that they fire up once a year and still operate. But the rest of these stations, which were mostly coastal, there are little groups of people who are, try to recreate what happened here 75 to 100 years ago. And they've gone through up in Belfast, Maine, out with Bartley in California, and station KPH, the Voice of the Pacific, in Point Reyes, California. This form of telecommunications before fiber optics and satellites, this is the way people could communicate instantaneously, at world-spanning distances. So the latest example that I've gotten, and the most sophisticated, is this Life Fellow of IEEE, Fred Chumacero, sent us at the History Center last fall a lengthy PDF of his analysis of this receiving station Daniel in Curacao, down in the southern Caribbean. It was the Dutch Netherlands, the Dutch and islands at the time. And he mapped out the topography, got the topographic maps, got Google Earth, got out his mathematical, modeling, electronics modeling programs, and worked out what this 2-kilometer antenna could receive, what the other one could transmit at a distance. It's just wonderful, quite, at various levels, sophisticated versions of how do you recreate the electromagnetic spectrum that people were using 100 years ago, 1910, 1920, to communicate. And it's the sort of thing I don't really know, to be honest, how you could apply this to television signals. But I'm hoping that amongst the 40 or so people in the audience, that some of this raises some, interesting possibilities for your own explorations in not just the hardware, but what we might call the software, the electromagnetic spectrum ware of our electronic world. So I believe that's going to conclude it, and I will stop there. There we go. Okay. Does that work? Is that good enough? Does anybody have any questions? Steve, you look a little frozen over there.
Alex?
Yes.
Regarding the artifacts that are still around, the last time I was in New York City, which was 1980, some of the antenna elements from the CBS experiments were still on the Chrysler building.
Really?
Yeah.
Because I the RCA side, I've heard about the Empire State Building and bits and pieces that people found there in the 2000s.
Right.
But you're the first person I've heard to talk about the Chrysler building.
In the 60s, late 60s, I was in the cable business in rural Florida, and the problem was the stations they were picking up were 120 miles away, and we researched what might work. At 120 miles with a conventional receiving system for television channels, which the technology was a tall tower, doesn't really cut it. And so we discovered that the Canadians had the same issue, and they were building these massive parabolic reflectors that were 300 feet wide and 100 feet tall, using a series of towers and then wires strung to make the parabolic shape between them. So we decided we'd do that. And we built a number of systems in rural Florida with these monster parabolic. They worked pretty well. There were problems with fading. But I guess maybe 5 years ago, I was in Florida, and I thought, hey, I'm going to go see what's left of these things. Naturally, by the time we went back, they'd all been dismantled. There was nothing left. They were using microwave to deliver the signals, but we did find remnants. We found the concrete bases where the towers were. We actually found some of the actual metal was still laying on the ground there. So that was I guess my journey into archaeology.
That's definitely the descendants of these guys with their 400-foot, 800-foot radio towers, Steve. And Canada is actually they're getting an IEEE milestone for their Canadian radio television microwave system that it was too expensive to lay cables, much like doing Africa phone service. They just jumped to microwave transmission from Nova Scotia to Vancouver. And like I said, Africa is just doing cell phones. They never did the copper wiring. But at some point, I'm hoping maybe some of you people in the TV cable business will, begin to do a computer model of the microwave transmission patterns and map it all.
Alex, can you hear me?
Yes, Mike. Hi there.
Hi. The big picture of what you're talking about is part of that story that I've found interesting of finding all the links in a chain to say, how did we get to here? From the very earliest in communications, electronics, and then you could also spread that out to all other kind of topics. The problem I've confronted is some people just don't care. They say, we got to here. Why do we need to look backwards if we're not going to bring back vacuum tubes? So that's one obstacle. But the other obstacle would be to really do the job of what you're talking about. We need to go to Elon Musk, who just spent $44 billion on something that I think is stupid, and see if he can get $1 billion to put an effort together to really, to bring those links back of how did we get to here. If you look at some of the people that are doing a good job with it, the Spark Museum up in Washington State, I forget his name.
John Jenkins.
John Jenkins. And, he put a whole ton of Microsoft money that he made into that and can basically have something going that I'd love to be able to do, but don't have the way to say money's no object. So then we're back to seeing what Elon Musk is doing. But anyway, I certainly applaud the idea, and the time is running out on some of us who could pass on some of this rebuilding stuff to the next generation. And then even in that respect, there's different views of what you would consider restoring an archaeological electronic artifact, or electronic fossils, as I call them. Do you go and just replace all the caps like you could see in the back of that chassis he was working on? Or do you take the other extreme of drilling out every capacitor that was in it, sliding a new one in it, sealing the wax back up, and if someone goes to look at that artifact, it's going to be just like the way it was? I have other friends in early radio stuff who won't even blow the dust off one. They just want to put it on a shelf as they found it, and say that's the way they're showing that link in the chain. So my kudos to you. I think you've got, if you're going to take the lead on this, you've got a big job ahead of you.
Well, like I said, the key is whatever you do with your set, it's really helpful to the next person that takes that set to have documentation. It's if you just say, look, I recapped everything and I gold plated the insulators or whatever, just say so.
Right.
And for that matter, if you've actually snuck, some fruit drop caps inside some of those old wax paper ones, make sure you tell them that too. Well,
another approach, Robert Lozier, I don't know if he's watching tonight, but he has a system with his collection that he assigns every piece a QR code.
Oh my!
So that it's a brilliant idea. Then right on his website, from your phone, it takes you to a whole explanation of the piece. That's on my bucket list to do some of that someday. But that might
some
be
people
something
a little more prosaic than that. I know a lot of people just intuitively just take all the old caps and parts and put them in a plastic bag and stuff that under the chassis, and it's better than nothing.
Alex, with regard to the documentation of the old AT&T sites and all, there was a guy named Albert LaFrance who had documented a lot of the.
Sorry, John, you're bouncing in and out there.
Okay, there was a guy named Albert LaFrance who had documented a lot of the AT&T circuits, both commercial and government, here in the Washington area. He had to take some of it down after 9/11 for obvious reasons. But there's also a site called Cold War Comms that coldwarcomms.com that has other documentation regarding AT&T's microwave circuits and so forth across the nation.
Okay. Now, I guess, I'm just sort of blue skying here, but it would, to my mind, be fascinating to take advantage of Google Earth, Google Maps. My boss at the IEEE History Center, Mike Gazelowitz, one of his early pitches was for technology tours that somehow you gave people a map. This was about 25 years ago. And said, here are some, important historic sites in, IEEE technologies, but they could be mechanical engineering, it could be civil engineering. You've got hydroelectric dams providing electric power and, giant rotors and so forth. But it could connect IEEE milestones. It could connect the British, blue plaque memorials. And with your QR codes and your phones and so forth, you can always, dig deeper for a little more information if you go to Pearl Street or RCA Lancaster or what's there instead of RCA Lancaster and look at what the world as it was. And then the other side that's related to this, electronic archaeology is, how do you map the use or the exploitation of the electromagnetic spectrum from AM radio bands or from, radio telegraphy right up to satellites. And, how could you model that on a map of Google Earth? It's like Steve was reminding me of the microwave transmissions. But I think it'd be kind of cool to have some sort of, 3D online or even, virtual reality or augmented reality. You put on your glasses and now you're following the microwave beam from Apopka to, Tuscaloosa or whatever. But I'm throwing that out there because I tend to think there must be a few people in this audience that have some of that modeling software and might have the interest to take something like this up. Start with a test pattern and work your way forward.
Alex, if you touch base with Al Clace, I think Al at least started a number of years ago to try to do something with Google Earth,
yes.
with important radio sites. I don't know that he ever got anywhere with it.
He's actually got that. I looked at it last week or the week before, and it's like, yeah, I want to take that further. We're poking away at an Edwin Howard Armstrong exhibit, and part of it I'd like to have would be the sort of, here's our Howard, riding his, Indian red motorcycle from 1032 Warburton Avenue in Yonkers down to Columbia to hang out with Michael Pupin and work on super heterodyne. And here he is, traveling to France and trying not to get shelled. And have this.
Here he is standing on the antenna.
Walk and ride in their footsteps. And then if you could actually get people to be like the riggers and get up on those 400-foot towers, that'd be something else as well.
Alex, this is Dave here from Philadelphia. How does an archaeologist view the difference between a 4,000-year-old sculpture and a 1932 radio that was built to be repaired, and what do you do?
Well, I will be the first to say I'm a historian, not an archaeologist, but it's an issue. What I do understand with the archaeologists is that they are constantly pulling their hair out at people that, they had a construction site for their McMansion and they found a bunch of Native American artifacts and they go, oh, this is really cool. Let me take these down to the museum. And the people at the museum say, well, where were these in the ground? It's like, oh, I don't know. We put the sewer pipe in there. And the archaeologist is saying, it's not just the object, it's the placement of the object in relation to other objects. So if you actually look at, I don't know, National Geographic documentaries of, not just industrial archaeologists, but their digging is painstaking and tedious. It's horribly dull for the rest of us. But they learn an awful lot about the relationships between these bone fragments or plate fragments. And you might find the same true with, a radio chassis is too neat. It's already assembled. So I'm not quite sure how to respond to that. But it's one of these issues that, the archaeologists and industrial archaeologists, and that is a subset of archaeology. It's more recent, obviously, but they have some at the Smithsonian Institution. Bartley, found at least one out in California, and they'd be worth, if you've got a particular question, is like, you're in Pennsylvania, Dave?
Yes.
Yeah, call the Pennsylvania Historical Commission and ask if they've got an industrial archaeologist you could talk to if you wanted to bounce some questions like that off of them. Because I will say I know of them, but I don't know the details of how they work.
No, I'm just more curious between the archaeology and the historic. What do you do with a thing from 1932? Leave it alone? Cover it up? Or just put some new parts in and let it play?
Well, like I've been saying, it's like if you put the new parts in, you should at least keep a log of what are the new parts and what were the old parts. I think I know a little bit about old car owners, and some of them go to the literally gold plating and chrome plating the engines, and it's like that was a historic car, but it's not anymore.
Hey, Alex, I got a question for you.
Yeah.
I'm thinking back to it was in 1997. A friend of mine
You're
was
dropping out,
working
Dave.
at Bell.
I'm sorry.
Let me come. Well, actually, in 1997, a friend of mine was working at. No, still dropping out.
You were.
It's on his end, Dave.
Am I coming through
You're
clearly?
fine, Dave. Yeah, you're doing
Okay.
fine.
Yeah, it's
Pay
okay
your bill,
here.
Alex. Okay. Pay your Wi-Fi bill. In 1997, a friend of mine was working at Bell Laboratories, and he had written a script celebrating the 50th anniversary of the transistor. And management was at that time completely uninterested in doing anything. In fact, he even brought me in, and to Mike's point of view of point of not having money to do these things, I actually offered to do the program for free, and the comment I got from the vice president was, "We are a forward-looking company, not a backward-looking company," and that project was dead. Now they've obviously recovered from that mindset, but I'm just wondering if you could speak to that and whether you'd be open to using any personal experiences from your time at the Sarnoff Center.
I can't write any checks anymore.
Well, one of the challenges that I've observed is that as soon as a company begins to promote its past, and I think this is especially true of a high-tech company, once you start talking about the glories of the past and marketing those, it tells your customers you don't have anything current or you don't have anything future. If you're not selling your past as an integrated package with what you're doing now, what you anticipate doing in the future, that company is in big trouble. And given the vicissitudes of Bell Laboratories, at that point it was Lucent, I think, and then it went to Alcatel, and now it's owned by Nokia. And if you go up to, so-called Murray Hill in Berkeley Heights, New Jersey, they've leveled one building, and there are huge chunks of the remaining buildings that are empty. They have a fraction of the staff they had at their peak, much like the David Sarnoff Research Center in Princeton. It's always scary when you end up going to a company that's functioning and trying to pay its bills and seeing how many empty rooms and abandoned pieces of equipment there are in them.
Apparently, they've quite spiffed up their lobby museum display though over the years. I just heard that the other day from somebody.
Yes.
I don't know if Matt's on the call tonight, if he wants to talk about that, but it was remarkably different than I remember it from the 80s.
Yes.
Which was good.
Plunged a lot of money. They've got a nice statue or a sculpture of Claude Shannon, the so-called father of information theory, along with Alexander Graham Bell in the main lobby. And without having to sign in, to the right is this little museum. I don't think it's quite as big as the David Sarnoff Library, but it's packed with stuff, all very professionally mounted and displayed and so forth. And the last time I was there, which is now over 5 years ago, they had some touch screens where you could sort of skim around and look at what the technologies of the past, how they lead to the technologies that Bell Labs is working on now, or something like that. And they went in a big way for IEEE milestones. They got 4 of them to sort of cover everything that Bell Labs did that was significant. And the frustrating thing with those is that those are actually stuck inside the auditorium. And for that, you need an escort to go see them, which is not what they're supposed to. If you go to, the SRI International David Sarnoff Research Center, the plaques are in the front of the building, and you can drive right up and look at color television right there, along with LCDs. But it's a challenge. It's finding somebody like John Jenkins or Gary, what's his name, who worked with Bill Gates, or Paul Allen, who made that experimental music museum in Seattle. It's getting some of those people to say, the way we've evolved or progressed from the past, it's important for people to understand. American culture isn't based on a respect for the past. The theme or the myth that we have is that we left Europe to break away from the past and create our own future. But after 300, 400 years of American history, it's kind of useful to look back and say, okay, what what went wrong, what went right, how can we maybe use this to learn some lessons for the future? And that's as true in technology as it is in any place else.
And if you don't do that, you're going to run into a time when, like I did with a kid you're trying to explain how hard it was to get television. And he says, well, why didn't they just watch on their phone?
Then you show them a phone.
Yeah, that's right.
But Steve, I guess, when I was cobbling this together and I pulled out my spare hard drive with my photos from the David Sarnoff Library, and I went back to 2003 and that first meeting. And I recall, at the end of the dinner, you had us all together and said, well, thanks, this has been a lot of fun. And I'd had, I don't know, several glasses of wine or whatever you were offering at the convention center, and got up and said, Steve doesn't know this yet, but he's going to begin doing this on an annual basis, just like the Antique Wireless Association. And I'm incredibly, impressed and in awe that, by golly, 19 years later, you still have a great crowd and a dedicated network here and abroad.
Well, and the interesting thing, as you probably know, this is the last 2 years we haven't had a meeting, and this year, and it was about the same crowd, for a long period of time. It was the same people. There'd be a few new people, but basically it was the same faces you saw every year. This year, so far, we have 20 people that I've never heard of that are showing up, which is good because it's, a lot of us are getting old. Like, we're all getting old, but a lot of us are getting very old. And we're sort of going to need some replacements if we're going to keep this going.
Well, it's one of those things. I observe this a little bit with the New Jersey Antique Radio Club. Is, I try not to collect radios. I'm collecting dark chocolate wrappers, as something a little smaller. But I have noticed over 20 years that when I first came in, to this field, and you found there were a lot of people that were very enthusiastic about Atwater Kent sets, and perhaps John Logie Baird and Jenkins televisions. And now 20 years later, I don't know if you're observing this because you're much closer to the pulse of television collecting than I am, but I'm kind of imagining people are maybe more attached to their, Sony Moon helmet sets or the sets they grew up with other than the sets their grandparents grew up with.
Yeah, I've noticed.
As an antique car collector on the side with a pair of old Cadillacs going to shows, over the years, I've watched what I call the collecting bubble move from 40s cars to 50s to 60s. I go to a show with my 1959 Cadillac and I'm surrounded by 60s, 70s muscle cars. It's just the bubble is moving forward, and it's
that are selling for $50,000 a piece now.
It's the music, it's the car, it's the television and radio, the computer that you grew up with. It's
exactly.
Like you said, it's a moving bubble.
Exactly. It's your direct connection to what you remember in your past growing up, riding in whatever, watching whatever.
And Alex, if I can add to that, with the New Jersey Antique Radio Club, I see more and more, if we have younger collectors, they're talking about mid-century furniture, mid-century artwork, and therefore mid-century radios. And they seem to be hot. The coral plastic radio, clock radios. I mean, it's things that we wouldn't even think twice about 20 years ago are now very saleable.
Exactly.
I don't understand that with television sets because the when you get to the
here it is. The current
when you get into the
70s,
70s,
bright orange 70s, Kmart TV.
When you get to that era, the sets all look the same to me. Because that's showing where my interests lie.
No, nothing looks like bright orange.
Well, that's an exception.
Well, we are talking about moving the limits forward a little bit at the museum into the mid-century modern era, or even the 60s. So that's just acknowledging the reality of the visitors' interests, I guess.
And it's the nostalgia of the people, of the age group.
That's exactly right. It's you better start displaying your Tamagotchi and little digital handheld games. It is moving into a digital era, and that's what the people are familiar with. You have no idea how emotional I am about the, I think it's a red LED clock I bought in 1981. It displays digits that are not recognizable in this solar system. So I can't tell time with it anymore. But I actually found there are other people, they made, I don't know, tens of thousands of these, and they're very reliable, made in Taiwan or wherever it was.
Well, I think the other thing is that we don't always make it very interesting for the younger generation to understand what it is that we have. Working with younger children to say, so here's a television set and it's only in black and white. How do you think that, it's that way with cars. It's that way with everything. If you don't take the time to get younger kids, instead of saying, don't touch that, you're trying to say, you want to turn a knob, see what happens. The idea is they have to feel the same way we learned how it started. When you think about it, it was usually picking up some neighbor's garbage and trying to figure out what was going on. Well, we've got to do something for them so they stay interested and get interested in this. It's not a one-way street. It's not knowledge that's just sitting there. It's knowledge that has to be introduced to them.
And I think you have to explain, like Calvin's father did in Calvin and Hobbes, that when he was growing up, the world was in black and white.
Yeah, they don't believe me when I tell them the mirrors were in black and white.
It's funny. I'm one of the youngest people on this call by probably 25 years, and I spent the last 10 minutes trying to get my microphone talking so I can give you guys pointers. But I've listened to half the stuff you said, and that's exactly the same things I see. Make it interesting, because I'm an anomaly. I'm already interested. You already got me. I'm not going anywhere. But why would I bring some of my friends down here who have no interest in this stuff? Everything in your museum is older than for me, for sure. But almost everything in that museum is older than my parents, and I'm 36. So you got to think like that. There's already 2 or 3 generations disconnected, and there's a lot of disparage towards the stuff that we are nostalgic for. 70s stuff's nostalgic for me, and that's still before I was born. So if you want it to stay, you have to have that connecting thread back from A to B, and some of this stuff's already at F or something, and you're trying to get it up to now. Why should I care? I mean, I'm talking on a radio now. I'm on a wireless headset, so it's making that connection back and the importance and following it up. And, it's hard. And a lot of the stuff you're talking about, like the institutional knowledge, like my company has no nostalgia for its past, but it was bought and sold 19 times. What company history is it? Their company started 2 years ago. They might have remnants of something that was from, Alfred Nobel, but that was 15 companies ago, and how much of that intellectual property actually belongs to that company now, and stuff like that. So it's messy, and it's interesting. And the only thing I can say is just to plug something that Dave said a few years ago, is you guys spent your lives doing this stuff, whether it's collecting it or working in the industry, and you're passionate about it, and you're spending your Wednesday evening on it, but you can get hit by a bus tomorrow, and I'm one of very few people my age that gives a shit, and I'm not going to remember anything you guys said. So write it down and tell people where it is, and tell people what you want to happen to all this stuff, so there is a chance of it surviving, because I can only suck up so much of it. And this is such an esoteric hobby, and I've spent hours listening to some of you guys talking about the weirdest, most obscure stuff I've ever seen in my life, and I'll maybe retain 1% of it, when you guys are gone. So do whatever the hell you can to make it survive, but you have to actively do it, because your kids you're gonna throw all your shit away when you die. Like, oh, that TV doesn't look any different to that TV over there, and one of them's the only one in the world, and one of them's in every TV in America in 1955. So it's a challenge.
Matt's always refreshing to have talking on these group sessions with us people of our age.
Always cheery.
It's good this is all being recorded. Okay, it's all recorded. So some young guy would be looking at, or gal, and they say, look at all these old guys are dead, and look at all this crap they're talking about. I wonder what that is.
Yeah, but you think that, but that stuff doesn't stay either, like I'm just young enough where I caught 5 years into the birth of the internet. I remember when people made websites about one really esoteric thing, like this guy dedicated his life to documenting toasters or something. Well, if you go out on the internet, most of those sites are gone because most of the sites that gave free web space have given up. The people that are passionate enough to make their own website have to pay a registrar and have to maintain it, and then they die, and then no one pays that anymore. So it happens a lot.
Yeah.
And archive.org's out there,
Yep.
but they're one of the few, and they need money too. So it's a constant battle because everybody thinks, oh, it's recorded forever. Well, it's recorded until it's not useful anymore to someone that makes money off of it.
That's I have to think that say Steve or anybody else with a museum or a collection, it's map out a plan for a series of videos. They don't have to be long. They could be 3 minutes, they could be 10 minutes, they could be 30 minutes. Pick a subject or an object and just walk people through, here's what this did, here's why they did it, here's what you could see with it or do with it, here's why you couldn't see other stuff on it. Just the videos on YouTube, because Google's not going to lose that intellectual property for a long time. And people do like watching a well-made video. There's that fellow in France that makes vacuum tubes from scratch to a soundtrack. It's delightful.
That's a great idea. I don't know about well-made videos, but we try. Yeah. Alex, I got to say that the whole thing was very thought-provoking. I particularly, I'm sort of processing what you said about the intuitive part of the process that Scott was talking about. I was actually thinking about that earlier today. People were talking about doing video editing with certain types of equipment back in the 80s or in the 70s or in the 90s. And I was sitting there thinking of equipment that I used to use that I knew, completely intuitively. I call it like playing a piano. You just do it. You don't have to think about it. I couldn't do that anymore. If I had those old pieces of equipment here today and they were working, I know I wouldn't be able to use them, and I might not be able to tell you how I was, even though I played them like a piano back in the day. And we had, when I was a kid, we used to we'd fix the record players and radios and even televisions. A lot of it was easy. There's a lot of low-hanging fruit that the neighbors would bring to us, and they didn't have to take it to the TV repair guy. But we were so smart because we know how to do this, but we didn't have any training. Somehow it was intuitive. I used to fix pinball machines. There was no training for that. There was no book on how to do it. You just figured it out and you did it. And I used to be able to fix pinball machines with just go in cold, figure out what was wrong. I don't know if I could do that today. And there are people documenting that kind of stuff, but it's not nearly enough. It's some really interesting points you make.
Well, I will say my introduction to the history of technology, which is how I ended up at the David Sarnoff Library in the first place, was I was an intern at the Smithsonian, which had a Sloan Foundation, Sloan being that guy that started a company, or he built a company called General Motors. But they got a grant in the late 1980s to find out how could you make oral history better by adding video. And Dave Sika will know this perhaps better than most of you on the line, but doing video is expensive, or it was expensive before smartphones. And they got, 1-inch Betacam, sound team, and they said, all right, let's do video histories, interviews with people, like oral histories, which is its own profession and discipline. But let's see what happens when you say, we can also record video, not just a talking head, but what did that talking head do? Or if we show the talking head, some aspect of their life in the past. And they used a whole bunch, they offered this to all these Smithsonian curators. So they had an industrial archaeologist that went up to a marble quarry in Vermont to watch how it operated in the 1980s. And then they had a paleontologist who was 96 years old, and he demonstrated, here's how I sort these little fossils that are they're the size of BBs, and how I separate them. And, you know, here's Ed Azell and Eugene Stoner explaining how you assemble, you know, an AR-14. It was just a variety of technologies and what you could show with them. And I'm thinking with, again, you know, especially the CRT rebuild efforts, if you've got video documentation of that, you know, you've got Dave Sika sort of sitting around as a video editor, it would be a useful exercise to say, okay, here's how you rebuild or try to rebuild, but you did succeed in a number of cases, rebuild the CRT and edit that together and put it up on YouTube or, you know, on your site. But, you know, we might say YouTube is a little more durable, notwithstanding the Internet Archive. And this goes true for anybody else with a collection. I mean, Mike Molnar, I know you've got amazing stuff. I know Dave Abramson's got amazing stuff. I'm sure there's, you know, 20 other people at least on this this call, as it were, that have just, you know, remarkable things. And it's up to you to, you know, do some decent lighting and, you know, natural lighting or whatever, and just talk your way through it.
Alex, just a comment here. About 20 years ago, I'm going to say 20 years ago, I went down to the Hornbeck Library at the University of Maryland to take a look at some old 2-inch machines that they had laying in the basement. And they were all train wrecks. But I got a tour through the building and got talking to the director, whose name I forget, and asked them about their preservation of video 20 years ago. And this was early digital. And he said, we don't want anything to do with digital. Anything we save right now is on Betacam SP. It's linear. It's not some kind of stair step thing. And I thought that was just brilliant of them to do that. And do you see digital catching up with analog as preservation?
That would be a question for an archivist, and I confess, you know, I really am trained as a historian. I worked part-time as an archivist, so I can pretend to be one on television. But I can say that the transition to digital archiving, I'm certainly aware there are people at the National Archives and state archives, and even presumably the University of Maryland archives, that everything is born digital since at least the mid-1990s. It's like, yes, you might have printed them, you know, documents out in a 3-inch binder, but they were born digital. And I know institutions are losing, you know, amazing quantities of their records because they're not migrating them. They're not doing records management properly. There was, you know, a case study of a small college in the United States that they have no history from the 1990s to 2010 or 2015, whenever they noticed, hey, we need to pay attention to, you know, what the faculty meetings were, you know, what was recorded. And so this is a broader issue. It's not just bit rot and link rot, but it is ways of, you know, migrating your digital media, text, video, audio, forward in formats that people will be able to play in the future. You know, we had a whole bunch of video material that Maurice Schechter very graciously digitized for the David Sarnoff Library when we were closing up. And he gave this out on hard drives, and he, as far as I can tell, made sure that they were on some sort of open format with that little orange cone. Dave Sika may know what I'm referring to. But it should be, you should be able to play it back indefinitely. Is the challenge. You don't want to get stuck with, Microsoft is no longer supporting this, Apple's no longer supporting this, Adobe's no longer supporting this. Java is JavaScript is dicey. Flash Player's been abandoned. People lose parts of their sites like that as a result, and it is an ongoing challenge because these are still commercial intellectual property that's controlled by corporations, and it's always a challenge convincing, say, even Apple to let people repair their own smartphones. And the same is true with you really can't mess with our software code and have access to it.
Well, there is a fellow I know who some of you may know. His name is Mark Shubin. He's pretty much the leading voice on the subject, and I know that Mark has been adamant that there is currently no good way to preserve digital media. He's pretty pessimistic about that. In fact, he's gone as far to say that video shot digitally would certainly be best preserved on 3 strips of black and white negative film.
I guess
this is my industry, and I can tell you that it's an uphill battle because it continues to change. It's faster and faster. There's less focus on industrial standards, like video standards or, even document standards. It's all whoever comes out with the next big thing makes a shitload of money, then sells it, or someone gets bought and they kill it. And it's the good thing about it is the technology that helps with the archiving is usually around entertainment. So people want to play games from 40 years ago. So they're going to go through more efforts to make this stuff work again than they wanted to do to read something or to watch their grandson's birth or something like that. So there is focus on it, but it's an uphill battle, and it gets uglier and uglier. In my company 12 years ago, before it was bought twice, went to digital lab notebooks. We're talking about they're an R&D facility, so they had a library, a Scrooge McDuck vault of all the lab notebooks. Someone went and scanned them, and they put them into this proprietary system, and then the company was bought out. So like, well, now what? We're not paying that license fee for that software, or that company doesn't exist anymore, and so they're printing them out, or they're exporting them to PDF and putting them on some hard drive somewhere. And then when the company divests, what happens to it? So it is a constant uphill fight, and it will get worse before it gets better. The one thing I did see that's interesting is sometimes this problem, it makes new technology come out. So one of the things that they're doing for magnetic media capture, you guys grew up in this time frame from 8-inch discs to now, that they're all different file formats and file allocation tables and all these magic tricks to make stuff that's copy protected and things like that, and system specific. So there's a bunch of people out there that just got tired of racing the magnetic media age line, and they're making equipment that records the RF signal change on the disk and capturing the image not as zeros and ones, but as in the magnetic flux difference between different parts of the disk, so that they can just recreate that on everything no matter what, and eventually simulate every format they can find, just because of the data. It's harder to do it the digital way. It's harder to make all this stuff work that way. And it's interesting, and it'll be interesting to see how they do that when, 40 years ago, they're trying to read a USB drive from 1997 or whatever, but.
I think that's called Betacam SP.
Film, yeah, microfilm, printing stuff off. You can read something from 600 years ago, or more,
Alex, thank you very much for your presentation. I'm going to have to leave now. I've got an early appointment tomorrow. I really appreciate it. It was really thought-provoking. And I hope to see you in person sometime.
Yes, likewise, Steve. The last couple of years obviously have been difficult for everybody, and Next year would be the 20th anniversary.
Yep. Yep.
So I think a road trip to Hilliard may well be in order.
Well, we'd love to have you.
Steve,
Well,
I have one quick last question on the Silvertone. Do you know if that Silvertone or its Westinghouse cousin was a Vassos design for the cabinet, or does anybody know?
I don't know. It doesn't look like it. It doesn't have any of the classic Vassos, look. But I have no idea.
Okay, just asking.
You could always go, Dave, to when you're feeling strong. The Syracuse University has half of his archives, and the Smithsonian, what is it called? The Museum of American Art, I think, has another chunk of his papers. And there's a woman who did her PhD on Vassos and turned it into a book. She has a website online. I'm blanking on her name, but she came to the David Sarnoff Library, and the book is out in hardcover. I don't know that it'll give you that sort of level of detail, but
Right.
she's the sort of person that could give you some information about the archival collections.
Thank you all.
Thanks.
Well, thank you all, and thank you, Steve, for hosting these every month. This is a great way to keep people networked. I think if we look at the glass being half full rather than half empty over the last couple of years, the ability to Zoom and WebEx, groups like this has been a great development.
I agree. I agree.
Did you know there's a third answer to the glass half full, half empty?
The glass is broken?
The glass is the wrong size.
Yeah, well, that makes sense. Well, good night, everybody. Thanks for participating. I assume you're going to keep talking.
Night, Steve.
All right. Good night, Steve. We'll see you soon.
Okay, bye.
I want to mention, talk about transmitting radio waves. There's a tower, a Marconi Tower in Binghamton, New York. And at one time there was two of them there. The way I understand it, the two towers, the way they transmitted, they had a wire that went between them. And the whole purpose of it was to do a test. Okay, a test. And what it was is they had a transmitter on the train, and they wanted to see whether or not the moving train, it would still work to transmit to the to ground and back. I don't know if anyone else heard much about that, but there's still one tower remaining for historic purposes.
I'm sorry, Joe, was this the one in Binghamton?
Yes, in Binghamton.
It was one of the first, it wasn't an IEEE milestone. It seemed to me there was a local dedication in like 1999. I drove up from Princeton because David Sarnoff was involved in setting up and operating the radio on the train between Binghamton and Scranton, I think, yes? And we thought that was the first use of non-inductive wireless communication on a train. I'm not entirely certain that's the case still.
Yeah, whether they, you laugh about it today, but does the Doppler effect, work on radio waves? I think that was what I think they might have had in mind. With it, that from what little I didn't research it. I just stumbled across it sometime that, looking at a map, and it says, well, the Marconi Tower's there. Oh, really? And I grew up in Binghamton, and no one ever talked about it or said anything about it or cared about it, or probably were there when they
tore it. There was a very good radio restoration company in Binghamton. I'm forgetting the name of the family. There was sort of a father-son, daughter group that sort of, as far as I know, spearheaded this the effort to dedicate this plaque to that.
There's a Macintosh makes vacuum tube amplifiers there. They still make them. They've been there. They're still there.
I don't know if it was Dave Sika or somebody else on the New Jersey Antique Radio Club that sent the link about the American company expanding its horizons beyond the WD-100, is it? The vacuum tube company in Georgia?
I don't know.
The Western Electric, the Western
Yeah.
Electric guy. Yeah, I was talking about them recently, but I don't know that I was talking about it publicly with the club. What was the conversation?
Somebody shared a link, and you can go and see the company's website.
There was the whole point of it was the bringing back with the whole thing with going on in Russia, that bringing back exotic vacuum tubes back to the States, especially Western Electric 300Bs, which all the audiophiles want desperately, and there's the money right there.
Yeah.
That was
I had reached out. I had reached out to them, Alex. I was curious because Nick Williams had uncovered a source for new CRT guns, for new cathode material, and he actually had gotten some engineering samples sent to him, and they were good. They were going to work in his efforts to rebuild the television CRTs, and then everything changed because his source was in Russia, and now he can't get them anymore. So I asked the guys in Georgia if they'd be interested in talking about that, and I got back a boilerplate form letter email from them. So I have to assume from that they are not.
Right. Yeah, their website struck me as, I mean, they're very businesslike for very good reasons.
Well, they're not going to be selling $800 cathodes to the TV crowd, that's for sure. But hey, Alex, I'm curious. Do you know where the pole farm is or was in Powhatan? Because I could throw a rock out my window and hit Powhatan from here.
No,
and I didn't know anything about it.
I don't. I'm thinking if you go to worldradiohistory.com and go into the technical section and search Powhatan on whichever group of journals you can, you should be able to find at least one article in presumably the Bell System Telephone Journal or whatever. They must have an article on Powhatan.
Okay.
If there's no historical society taking it seriously. Wayne Brettel, that's a beautiful view out your window behind you.
Alex, I did want to mention I did make it up to the Murray Hill Museum just like 2 or 3 weeks ago, just to see it because it's been on my list. Unfortunately, it's it's not like a Smithsonian where they got normal visitor hours. It's when people are working, and I happen to also be working when those people are working. So it was neat, but I was probably there for an hour and a half, and not a single person looked my way or said anything or cared that I was there. So it was self-guided, but they did have those touch screens, like you said, and they had stuff there talking about the stuff, and it was more like it to sell it, like kind of like they're saying, oh, here's the stuff we do now, and here's how it relates, and here's how we got here, which is nice.
Right.
But it would have been nice to talk to an old guy for a while about it and get a little bit more context than just say, oh, first transistor. I'm like, yeah, that's pretty cool. Is it super, super, super cool? But it'd have been neat to get a little more with that, Yeah.
Matt, you know who does it upright? The World War II Museum down in New Orleans. When I stopped in there a couple of years ago, I had a World War II veteran was one of the docents that day who told me about the exhibits. Now that's the way to do it. We can only aspire to that.
But you could also see what you were saying about the building falling into disrepair. I mean, the lobby is obviously as nice as it's going to be, right? But you can look up the second level and there's a balcony. You can see a bunch of file cabinets and storage and stuff like that, and that's in the lobby. And it's like, obviously, you know, I'd read an article about that. They said that like they were taking like, there were parts of buildings where they had like one light bulb lit because, you know, it was a lot easier to keep that place running when you had the bell system with the, you know, the monopoly on the phones and all the money coming in, so you can get the research money a little bit, you know, they have more money coming in, whereas nowadays, you know, it's just Nokia's left with it, you know, and they obviously make money doing modern things, but it's not the same, you know, as it was. So the economies of scale.
No, and it's like just trying to be aware of like thinking, well, the research labs at Intel and AMD or Google, Facebook, Microsoft, that's where the funding and the offices are really nice. But I have to say, I'm quite pleased at the amount of RCA's history that's been preserved, not just in New Jersey and Delaware at the Hagley Library, but out in Indianapolis, NBC's collections in Wisconsin. The State Historical Society has a terrific NBC collection, and the Library of Congress has like the other half of that. So those are doing very well. And then I know there's quite a bit of Westinghouse material at the Heinz Center outside of Pittsburgh. But I'd be curious as to what happens to, say, Zenith, you know, if there's a Zenith collection at LG still. Whether there's anybody on the call that has Chicago connections.
Wayne's here.
I was just typing on the chat and I didn't hear what was said until Zenith heard to my ears. So what was the question?
Do you have any idea, Wayne, about the fate of Zenith Archives? Does it have a collection in the company, do you know?
I don't know what exists. I retired 6.5 years ago, and but the person to contact would be John Taylor, who I think is still the PR person there.
Hey, Alex, this is Jeff. How are you?
Hello, Jeff.
Up in Chicago a few years ago, they did it was an anniversary of Zenith, and they were able to get out of the archives Commander McDonald's mother's Zenith Stratosphere, a mirror in lid set, and other stuff. And the guys that wrote the Zenith books had access to the archives that are still there, but they're not in good condition. They're sitting in a warehouse. They moved them around to get them out from under the leaks in the roof. So right now, they exist.
Okay. That's some consolation.
Alex, I really enjoyed his thought-provoking. I have to drop off and go on a camera club meeting since I'm the vice president and I'm the one they blame if it doesn't happen. Bye-bye.
I'm glad you're doing a double session tonight, Wayne.
Do I remember a few years ago that the ETF had some line on getting into the Zenith archives and some of the even, TV sets?
I have no idea, and Steve has left the building, as it were.
Stay tuned. By the way, how many of these suspects here on this screen are going to be at the convention? Raise your hand or whatever.
You lucky devils. Now, I'm just going to throw in a plug here. I don't know how many of you are aware of this book, Bright Signals by Susan Murray. It's a history of color television. She drew on the Hagley Library's collection, color illustrations that she managed to obtain. It's not going to be a pure technical history, but it's going to be a very thoughtful, perspective on, color television. So, I'll throw in a little plug for Dr. Murray's work here for you.
Is that the Hagley Museum down in Wilmington, or where is
Yes,
this?
it is. It's the Hagley Museum and Library, and the library is where Fred Barnum deposited about 280 linear feet of RCA Camden collection documents, the historical materials that Ben Aldridge used for his History of Victor talking machine, a number of RCA Victor, developing the Hall of History for RCA in Cherry Hill, New Jersey. Huge runs of the technical reports and technical memos, and then any number of publications. And then in 2009, I arranged for the transfer of about 2,800 linear feet of Princeton reports, some Somerville, some Lancaster collections. We collected the Lancaster material as best we could when Thompson shut that down in 2007, and photographs, photo negatives, and they got a six-figure grant from the federal government's what's it called, the Museum and Library Services program, to basically catalog and organize this collection, which is all up online. If you Google Hagley Sarnoff, you'll get introduced to the Hagley's RCA collections. Because it also has David Sarnoff's papers, which are not always that useful, but he had some amazing photo albums, very good collection of material on his trip to Japan in 1960, which sort of lined up RCA's licensing to the Japanese electronics industry, and a number of other things. But we got the RCA Laboratories notebooks, at least the ones that hadn't been burned, after some of the shadow mask lawsuits. There was one index card in the notebook catalog. Each notebook, or each researcher had an index card with the notebooks that had been signed out to them. And Al Schroeder's had the notebook with the three-necked dragon for the shadow mask. And on the index card was the number 98,754, and then there was a little red pencil drawing of a fire next to it, with it crossed out, because once they got through the lawsuit with Philco or whoever was contesting it, they said, okay, make sure this doesn't come up again. If you don't have it, the other side can't ask for it, which is why legal departments often say the best archive is no archive. Basically, we don't trust what's in our own collections to be used against us as opposed to for us. And General Electric was a very good example of this with the Hudson River PCBs, because the Hall of History had plenty of documentation on what they did with their runoff and so forth. But the Hagley is, I think it's open now by appointment. They've gotten to that point at this point in the pandemic, and you can go there, bring an ID and open things up. If you like railroads, they've got Pennsylvania Railroad collection is there. You want DuPont? They've got DuPont records. It's all there for, that's what they're there for.
The Hagley is quite the treasure around here in Southeast PA and Delaware.
Yes. They also have a very good collection of Pennsylvania mushroom farm industry, if you're into fungi.
I can just drive down to Tough Cattleman and get my mushrooms.
And I don't know if it's Raymond Louis, but they have some industrial designer, archives as well. So they took the original RCA Camden collection with their noses pinched because it was impressed on them that this is RCA. RCA is hugely important in, the technology history of electronics. But the people that run the Hagley, they're not engineers, and they were a little scared that they were taking a whole bunch of technical data, technical material that nobody would use. I think I was the first person to get a grant from them when I did my dissertation on the phonograph record. And I had to assure them that, okay, I'm not an engineer, but I can read the introduction. I can read the conclusion. And at least before the 1950s or 1960s, engineers generally wrote in plain English. There wasn't quite as much physics and mathematics in the reports as there was later. And it's ended up proving very useful. There are people who've done, like I said, the dissertation on color television, another dissertation and book on liquid crystal display televisions, The TVs of Tomorrow by Ben Gross, is very fine, beautifully written, not too long book on the history of LCD flat panel television development at RCA. Another researcher did MOSFET, the basic transistor that's used in virtually everything today. He drew on the collection there. Other people have done transistors. So somebody still has to do the big book on TV cameras. And when they're ready to do that, the Image Orthicon, Vladimir Zworykin's early notebooks are there. Vidicon technology with Paul Weimer. CCD technology with a whole group of people in the late 60s, early 70s. It's all available for the unpacking. Hello, Edward Milbourne. Good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you, Alex.
How's everything in Indianapolis?
Still there.
Still there.
Still there. Still happening.
It looks like the Thompson RCA collection is in good hands. I've just not been able to get out there and dig into it.
Yeah, well, thanks to Dave Arlen, among other people. So, and he's not here. I don't think he's on the
right.
But I'm sure he sends his regards.
Well, encourage him to go out to the convention next week. I won't be there, but I will be thinking of him.
Both of us, we're going together.
Oh, you are? Excellent.
Yeah.
Excellent. Okay.
Take care.
Cheers. All right, gentlemen. Well, it's 9:59. It's the witching hour here. So yeah. I will thank you all for listening and contributing and conversing and getting together. It's good to see some familiar faces. Yes, Dave.
Before you go, I was just rushing back to unmute my microphone. Dave Arlen sends his regards. He wanted to be on this meeting tonight. He wanted to hear what you had to say, but he was previously indisposed. He will be watching the recording shortly thereafter.
All right.
Okay.
Hey, John, how are you? I see your smiling text on the Google group all the time. So, but now I can see your smiling face and well-lit apartment or house. All right, gentlemen.
Enjoyed your talk, Alex. Good to see you.
Yes, thank you, John. Good to see you, Jeff. And until next time.
Good night, Alex.
Farewell.
Good night, Alex. Buddy.